Welcome to 1189, an online Bible commentary. My name is Tyler Marston, and today we're taking a look at Genesis chapter 42. Now, in the last chapter, we saw Joseph finally vindicated for all of his suffering. He was reflecting God's image, being fruitful with his children and with storing up food for all of the land of Egypt. He was blessing all the families of the earth through his actions. He was achieving all the good stuff God has promised his people through the book of Genesis. But back in Canaan, Jacob and his family, Joseph's brothers, aren't experiencing anything like that. The famine has reached them too, and they're feeling desperation and starvation. And that's far from the divine providence that Joseph is feeling on his life. In their desperation, they'll be tested in the same way that their ancestors were, especially Jacob, who's going to have to make a hard choice. So let's see what that choice entails in Genesis chapter 42. Now Jacob saw that there was grain in Egypt, and Jacob said to his sons, "Why are you staring at one another?" He said, "Behold, I have heard that there is grain in Egypt. Go down and buy some for us from that place, so that we may live and not die." Then 10 brothers of Joseph went down to buy grain from Egypt. So while Joseph was suffering, his brothers were living large. But now that Joseph is the one who's experiencing blessing, it's his brothers who are suffering. And Jacob tells his sons to go down to Egypt to get food during the famine, just like Abraham did in chapter 12. Though this time, God has worked a miracle so that they won't fall into any of the traps that Abraham got himself into when he disobeyed God to go down to Egypt. But Jacob did not send Joseph's brother Benjamin with his brothers, for he said, "I am afraid that harm may befall him." So the sons of Israel came to buy grain among those who were coming, for the famine was in the land of Canaan also. Now Jacob sends 10 brothers, right? Joseph's already down in Egypt, that's one, but he also doesn't send Benjamin. Benjamin is the youngest of the group. He's Jacob's baby. He's Joseph's only full-blood brother because he's the only other son Rachel delivered. And remember, Rachel was the wife that Jacob loved the most. And especially after Joseph's supposed death, Jacob really keeps a tight hand on Benjamin and is not going to let him go down on this perilous journey. But once again, he's doing that out of fear. He's acting out of fear instead of out of God's wisdom. Now Joseph was the ruler over the land. He was the one who sold to all the people of the land. And Joseph's brothers came and bowed to him with their faces to the ground. When Joseph saw his brothers, he recognized him, but he disguised himself to them and spoke to them harshly. He said, "Where have you come from?" And they said, "From the land of Canaan to buy food." But Joseph had recognized his brothers, although they did not recognize him. Joseph remembered the dreams which he had had about them. So Joseph's brothers show up one day and they start bowing down to him. And Joseph says, "This is exactly what God told me would happen." It's a fulfillment of that dream he had back in chapter 37. Now his brothers don't recognize him, and he realizes that this is an advantage if he plays it right. He is skeptical of his brothers who sold him into slavery and wanted to kill him. Naturally, anybody would be. So he speaks to them harshly and accuses them of being spies. And Joseph's brothers have to plead their case, and they start freaking out. They tell him how they're actually a group of 12 brothers. One has died, that's Joseph, and one is still back in Canaan with their father Jacob. Now, of course, that piques Joseph's interest because he's been living here with years with no word about his beloved brother Benjamin and no word about his beloved father Jacob. And Benjamin and Joseph surely have a very close relationship. I mean, they're the two that were most loved by their father, and they were probably the two that were most picked on by their brothers. And so Joseph wants to know if his brothers have changed before he gives them food, and he also, more importantly, wants to know if Benjamin is alive. I mean, if the brothers sold Joseph into slavery and tried to kill him, wants to stop them from doing the same to someone like Benjamin. So he concocts this plan, and he puts all the brothers in prison just like the one they inadvertently put him into. He tells them that if they go home and bring their brother Benjamin back, that he will consider them honest and worthy to buy bread in Egypt. He does send them on their way with enough grain to cover for the journey, but he's going to keep one son as a hostage to make sure they come back. And right when they're about to head home, they start mentioning how God must be punishing them because of what they've done to Joseph. Reuben, the oldest, even says this. Reuben answered them, saying, "Did I not tell you, do not sin against the boy, and you would not listen? Now comes the reckoning for his blood." So remember way back in chapter 37, Reuben, the oldest, didn't want to kill Joseph. He wanted to just throw him in the pit so that he could come and rescue him later. And he said, hey guys, don't shed any blood. Remember Cain and Abel. Remember how the blood cried out to God from the ground. And remember how God said in Genesis chapter 9 after the flood that whoever sheds blood, blood would be required of him. Our blood is about to be shed. We are about to be divinely judged because of what we did to our brother Joseph. Now, none of the brothers know that Joseph understands every word of the conversation they're currently having. He had been speaking with them through an interpreter up until this point to sell that idea that he really is this Egyptian lord. And he hears their concern and their regret for how they treated him. It really affects him. He has to hide his face to make sure they don't see that he's tearing up when they're talking about him. He took Simeon from them and bound him before their eyes. So Joseph takes Simeon as the hostage to ensure that they come back with Benjamin. Why Simeon specifically? We remember that Simeon was one of the masterminds behind the destruction of Shechem back in chapter 34. And it could also be related to his status as the second oldest. Out of all the brothers in the family, he has the highest social position except for Reuben, who is the actual oldest. And as the oldest, Reuben would presumably be in charge of pulling off this whole operation, overseeing the fact that his brothers get home and back. Plus, we know too that now Joseph knows Reuben wanted to save him the whole time and doesn't want to punish him for that. Then Joseph gave orders to fill their bags with grain and restore every man's money in his sack and to give them provisions for the journey. And thus it was done for them. So Joseph sends all the brothers back to Canaan, and he puts grain in the sack for their journey, but he also puts the money they were supposed to use to pay for that grain in their sacks too. And again, he's setting up a test to see how honest his brothers are. Now the brothers freak out whenever they finally open their sacks on the way home and realize that they've accidentally stolen all this grain. And when they get home, they tell Jacob everything. They tell him about this strange Egyptian lord who demanded to see Benjamin and took Simeon hostage until they could bring him back. Their father Jacob said to them, "You have bereaved me of my children. Joseph is no more and Simeon is no more, and you would take Benjamin? All these things are against me." So Jacob doesn't take Joseph's proposition well, to say the least. He's stuck between risking more of his children's lives and simply having enough food to eat. And in that way, it's sort of a callback to when God called Abraham to sacrifice Isaac. Jacob is going to be tested in the same way to see if he's willing to sacrifice, to part ways with, to offer up Benjamin. Then Reuben spoke to his father, saying, "You may put my 2 sons to death if I do not bring him back to you. Put him in my care, and I will return him to you." So Reuben offers to take responsibility for Benjamin, special responsibility, and puts his own 2 sons as collateral for it. Obviously, it shows how desperate they are for food and how much they really need it. But Jacob said, "My son shall not go down with you, for his brother is dead and he alone is left. If harm should befall him on the journey you're taking, you will bring my gray hair down to Sheol in sorrow." Jacob refuses Reuben, and he says, "You're not taking my son down there. Besides, I can't trust you. You're the guy who slept with my wife." And once again, we see that Jacob's love for Benjamin is so great, but it's almost a little too great. Remember Abraham back in chapter 22. He trusted more than anything. He believed that God would provide for him and for Isaac. Meanwhile, Jacob, who granted has experienced a lot of trauma, is not trusting God to provide when it comes to him and Benjamin. If anything, he's clinging to him and claiming that if he leaves, he'll die. In the same way, there's things that we all struggle with letting God have. We can't see how we would survive if God took them away. But we have to trust in God's promise that he will provide and he will be enough, that his grace will be sufficient for us. They encourage us to surrender everything we have to God, and in return, he will bless us and reward us with more than we ever had or could ever imagine having. And that's eternity with him, together providing for all of our needs. It might mean suffering here on this earth, but if we really believe that, if we really trust that, it's going to change the way we live our lives. It's going to change the way we relate to our things, our possessions, even our families. And it's going to free us up to be a blessing to all the people around us and to tell them what Jesus has done for us and for them. Thanks so much for watching 1189. I really appreciate it. Have a good day, and God bless.